Thank you very much, Drummond. I'm delighted to be here. Drummond modestly didn't mention his own formative role in terms of helping to make this film happen. Also, there's another guy you'll hear from later on in the economic panel, Rob Johnson, who is one of the executive producers of the film. So it's all of these things are connected, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to show a little clip from the film out of order. I'm going to show something toward the end, and then I'll attempt to explain it, talk a little bit about how it came about and why this subject is fundamentally important to the notion of democracy. So let's look at a quick clip first, and then I'll come back on and speak a little bit about how this happened and what the impact was and what I hope the impact will continue to be, and why this subject is so important to the essence of democracy.
This debate is occurring because of the Supreme Court's ruling that said that we must conduct ourselves under the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And that Common Article 3 says that there will be no outrages upon human dignity. It's very vague. What does that mean?
Do you believe that the use of testimony, which is obtained through techniques such as waterboarding, stress positions, intimidating use of military dogs, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, forced nudity, would be consistent with Common Article 3?
Well, sir, I think most importantly, I can't imagine that such testimony would be reliable.
Mr. Attorney General, do you believe that statements obtained through illegal, inhumane treatment which should be admissible?
Senator, well, again, I'll say this. The concern that I would have about such a prohibition is what does it mean, how you define it.
And who would define it? The Bush administration introduced a new law that would elude the restrictions of the Supreme Court.
In a legal sense, I think they wanted to discard the Constitution, and they wanted to write a new one. But you can't do that, so what you do is you throw a new interpretation on the old one. And the new interpretation is the executive in wartime, and perhaps this war is going to last forever, is all-powerful.
Congress gave the president most of what he wanted. He would agree to abide by the Geneva Conventions, so long as he could define their meaning and application. A few detainees at Guantanamo might be put on trial, but the rest would no longer have access to habeas corpus, the fundamental legal right to challenge their detention. Planning a run for president, even Senator McCain voted for the bill, soon after the Bush administration threatened to discredit him with conservative voters.
Buried deep inside this legislation is a provision that will pardon President Bush and all the members of his administration of any possible crimes connected with the torture and mistreatment of detainees, dated all the way back to September 11, 2001. At least President Nixon had Gerald Ford to do his dirty work. President Bush is trying to pardon himself.
The pardon did not extend to frontline soldiers.
The trial was a very confusing time for me because I've never been through trial before. I didn't know what was really going on. I kind of just understood that, I was facing a lot of time in jail. That's the only thing I really understood about the whole thing.
Well, I was sent to jail, went to a military correctional facility. I've lost my full-time job. I have a bad conduct discharge, which has hindered me in getting a new job in the same field. Financially, it's just devastated me.
I'm just glad it's over. That's it. Glad I can get on with my life.
I had to plead guilty to assault and 2 counts of dereliction of duty. In exchange, they'd say that I could go to jail for no more than 4 months.
rather than spend the money that was being spent for that trial, I think it could have been better spent in working on Army doctrine to make sure that other people go into battle properly equipped, properly led, and with a full understanding as to what their new roles and responsibilities are.
When a detainee is abused, or a detainee claims abuse, they want somebody to take the fall for it. And it's not going to be the person with eagles or stars on their shoulder.
No officer was ever convicted in the Dilawar case. Following her service at Abu Ghraib, Captain Carolyn Wood was given a staff position at the Army Interrogation School in Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
What does that reflect in terms of senior leadership's intentions? Not to eradicate the abuse, but to perpetuate the abuse.
I think the probabilities exist that there will be other terrorist attacks, that more Americans will die. And the argument that we have to apply abuse to detainees in order to protect American lives, I find to be violative of our deepest values and to the very safety of our country. We fight not only to protect lives, we fight to protect our principles.
Thank you. It's a little bit difficult for those of you who haven't seen the film to come in at the end like that. I was asked initially to do a film about torture, whether or not the United States had a policy of torture. On the face of it, it seemed a pretty simple, if daunting task, and yet what I discovered was that the more I got into it, the more complicated a subject it was. It wasn't just torture bad. There were avenues in this subject that led directly to some fundamental issues in democracy. And I was also daunted as a filmmaker as to how to make a subject about something that most people don't really want to think about, and that was a kind of a topic. And so I ended up focusing on, the film is called Taxi to the Dark Side. I ended up focusing on the case of a taxi cab driver, an Afghan taxi cab driver named Dilawar, who had never spent a night away from home. He was 22 years old, a very slight man, if handsome, 122 pounds, I believe. And he was taken from his village and brought to the Bagram prison in Afghanistan, where he was subjected to a 5-day interrogation. And after the 5th day, he died. And it was later learned that he died from wounds sustained in that interrogation. The Army coroner said that his legs had been pulpified, and he died of a pulmonary embolism. And so that case became a key case to follow it, not only to follow what happened in the field as a kind of a mystery story, but to take that case and follow it throughout the system. It was one of the reasons I chose the story of Dilawar, because the very people who interrogated him were later shipped on to a rather more famous interrogation facility known as Abu Ghraib. He was a taxi cab driver. The 3 passengers who were in his taxi cab were sent to Guantanamo to cover up for the crime. They were nothing more than peanut farmers. They spent 18 months in Guantanamo, at which point they were released. Most of us may know that, I believe, as of 2004, 93% of the detainees in Guantanamo were not captured by U.S. or coalition forces. So it emphasized that aspect. But the other thing that the Dilawar story emphasized was something very haunting to me. You know, in the original New York Times article that I read about it, it noted that it was a 5-day interrogation, but it also noted that after the 3rd day, the interrogators had pretty much concluded that Dilawar was innocent, and yet they continued to torture him for another 2 days until he died. That haunted me, because it seemed like, what is it about the inexorability of torture? Why would they continue to torture somebody when they knew that person was innocent? So I was haunted by why, on a human level, does such a thing happen? You know, what is that dark side that Dick Cheney talks about? Now, Taxi to the Dark Side, is, as many of you may know, was something that Dick Cheney said we were going to have to go over to about a week after 9/11. He told Tim Russert we're going to have to go over to the dark side. So what was it on a human level that would allow such depravity? but also why did our policymakers pursue it? As it turns out, much of what happened in the field, in Abu Ghraib and Bagram and other places, was not often the result of precise policy, though sometimes, as in the case of Guantanamo, it was. It was often a mixture of removing previous prohibitions on mistreatment, like the Geneva Conventions, and creating a kind of fog of ambiguity, and at the same time administering tremendous pressure to the people down at the bottom. And the question was, and that's why you see at the end this issue of all these guys being convicted of crimes while the policymakers at the top are pretty much let off the hook. But why did our policymakers try so hard to create an environment in which the gloves were off, in which the rules didn't apply? Particularly when our policymakers knew or could have found out from all of their military advisors that there's a good reason why this stuff doesn't happen, that there's a good reason why there are rules against this stuff, and that by and large, torture or coercive interrogation technique does not yield good information. So it was that question of why that haunted me. And what I went to do was to see it from the bottom to the top. And with the soldiers, I learned that there is a kind of, one of the reasons that the military has these rules is that there is what the military calls forced drift. Without these rules and guidance, if you're interrogating a prisoner and you're motivated to ratchet up the mistreatment, and that person doesn't answer you, you'll push it further and further and further and further and further. Also, the other thing I discovered was that these guys, there was a kind of perception that it was okay to do this stuff out there. We have our Constitution to protect us here. It was okay to do that stuff out there. But the fact of the matter was, these people who were being encouraged to mistreat prisoners and others were bringing their torment back here in ways that were also beginning to infect the body politic. Last, as far as the soldiers went, and it was haunting for me to talk to these people because I was not initially sympathetic, because they were these were people, after all, who murdered a young man collectively, these military police at Bagram. But they were scapegoated, and they were haunted by the fact that they had been driven by appeals to their patriotism to mistreat these prisoners and by superior officers, and yet somehow the superior officers weren't even being investigated, much less indicted. This led me up the chain to the civilian administration, and one of the things that I found most interesting about this whole process was that there was a kind of fiddling with the law, an attempt to redefine torture, as you saw from Mr. Gonzalez, who's always trying to parse the words, as many of the administration were trying to do. And there was a kind of ignorant embracing, an ignorance of history and an ignorant embracing of techniques which were originally designed by the Soviets and the Chinese communists not to obtain actionable intelligence, but to obtain false confessions. So we have a policy that is now getting intelligence, but the intelligence is actually, the means used are actually means that are best suited to obtain false confessions. Not the truth, but false confessions. Where this ultimately led, and it wasn't something that I initially thought about at the beginning, was that what's happening here is that there was a weird feedback loop and mechanism where the administrators at the top, and I'm talking about Dick Cheney primarily, and also David Addington, his key aide, and John Yoo and many others, they become more and more comfortable with the system because it just happens to reinforce their views about the war on terror. And a classic example is the interrogation of a man named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was a man who was captured and begun to be interrogated by the FBI. Good actionable intelligence was being obtained, but it wasn't the kind of information that the Bush administration wanted to hear. They sent the CIA in, the CIA took over, he was rendered to Egypt where he was tortured and waterboarded, and lo and behold, he came out with information that revealed that there was a direct connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. This information was used by Colin Powell in his address to the United Nations as a way of prefiguring the war in Iraq, sending us toward that war. Yet a year later, the CIA recanted the testimony of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, and so we now realize that what he told us was absolutely false, but it happened to feed directly into what the administration wanted to hear. So this, it seems to me, takes us directly to what Orwell talked about 1984, where you have the executive branch assuming enormous power to mistreat people in order to obtain the intelligence that undergirds their political power. And they're aided in this by a Congress that is complacent and a public that, it turns out, 35% of which believes in the efficacy of torture in some way, shape, or form. And so actually the Bush administration begins to campaign on this. So this was the educational process for me, and it's what led ultimately to my making the film. And it's why this issue, I think, is so important about democracy. Ongoing, though, I will also tell you that the resistance to this subject, because it's very difficult, I think, for all of us to engage this, because I think to some extent we're all complicit, because we've allowed this to happen. So the film itself had difficulty getting out, and indeed it was hobbled by a number of forces, a network that first bought it and then refused to show it, the MPAA, which refused to allow us to show certain images. But over time, we were able to win a number of awards and begin to break through. And I hope in the future we will continue to do that. But one of the things that was very satisfying to me from a filmmaking standpoint was that we tried very hard in the filmmaking of this not to approach this by talking to a number of recognized and predictable human rights activists, but to talk to people who are inside the system, who through their conscience felt great discomfort. You saw a number of them here at the end. And the result has been that the military, of all places, has warmly embraced this film, so much so that now this is being taught as it's required viewing for the Army JAG School. And and so as a filmmaker and as somebody who is interested also in social change, the challenge remains for us in the future to continue to find these unconventional distribution mechanisms and community groups that will continue to allow this film to reverberate, so that hopefully will provoke more questions in the future. And that seems to be succeeding. The film will be on HBO this fall, and we're going to engage more and more with community groups, and that's in order to be able to allow that message to reverberate and hook people up with the kind of tools that they need to have in order to be able to insist on the one thing that I'm nervous about going forward, which is a full investigation of what's happened in order to be able to embrace the future and reconnect with a sense of, reconnect with our own prior reputation throughout the world as a place that safeguards human rights. We have to show the world that we're able and willing to investigate what's been done in our name, and that remains the challenge for the future. Anyway, thank you very much.